The crowd cheered long after the blood dried. The roar of Rome's arena had no mercy. It swallowed men, broke armies, and crushed spirits. But the ones who suffered quietly, without applause, were the captive women dragged into the world of gladiators. These women never stepped into the arena as fighters. They were brought in as trophies, as symbols, as warnings. They came from conquered towns, burned villages, and defeated tribes. Rome took their freedom, but the gladiators took what was left of their pride. Inside the training schools, behind stone walls stained with sweat and fear, these women faced cruelty that Rome never recorded in its official histories. What happened to them was worse than death. And once you hear it, you will understand why their voices still echo inside the ruins of every arena Rome left behind. Taken after the smoke, the women Rome captured did not come quietly. When Roman legions stormed a village, everything ended in dust and screams. Homes burned, men were chained together, children were pushed into carts, and the women were taken last. Soldiers dragged them into the center of the ruined town, hands tied, hair tangled with ash. There was no trial, no hearing, no mercy. They were marched for days under a burning sun, feet bleeding, wrists bruised from rope. Some fainted, some cried. Most walked in silence, knowing begging would only bring the spear. And at the end of that road stood the gladiator schools. Massive stone buildings, iron gates, the smell of sweat and metal carried by the wind. The women had heard stories about what happened inside, but the truth was worse. The gate of no return. Gladiator schools were built like prisons. Thick walls, watchtowers, iron doors that slammed shut behind the new captives. Once the women crossed those doors, there was no leaving. The air inside was heavy, filled with the sound of men training, grunting, shouting. The clang of metal echoed through every hallway. The ground shook each time a fighter fell. The women were lined up in a yard. Lanistas, the masters of the school, walked past them slowly, studying their faces, their hands, their expressions. To the Lanistas, these women were not human. They were property, resources, punishment tools. Some women were forced into service inside the school. They cleaned the rooms, carried water, cooked meals, washed the blood-soaked sand from the training pit. Everything was meant to remind them, you do not belong to yourself anymore. The house of brutality. The gladiators lived inside the school like caged beasts. They trained until their bodies broke. They fought until their bones cracked. They lived every day expecting to die the next. And because their lives were filled with pain, they passed that pain down. When women were forced to serve inside the gladiator barracks, they walked into a world without rules. The halls smelled of iron, sweat, and dust. Men fresh from training limped past with injuries that made them angry, bitter, violent. These were not heroes, not legends, not the noble warriors the crowds loved. Behind the walls, they were prisoners who took out their rage on anyone weaker. The women lived in constant fear. A wrong look, a slow step, a drop bucket of water. Anything could trigger punishment. Some women were slapped. Some were kicked aside while working. Some had their hair pulled or were forced to kneel for hours as gladiators mocked them. There was no rest, no peace, no corner where they could breathe without feeling eyes on them. The arena created monsters, and these women lived among them every day. The arena's lesson. When a lanista wanted to punish a woman, he didn't always strike her. Sometimes he brought her to the edge of the arena, not during games, not during battles, but when the sand was empty, when the silence made every sound louder, when the smell of the last death still hung in the air. That was where the real punishment began. The lanista would force the woman to kneel in the sand. He would point to the bloodstains, the broken weapons, the torn cloth still scattered from the last fight. Then he would say something no prisoner forgot. This is where you end if you disobey. Some women were forced to watch training fights, brutal, violent, savage. Men struck each other with wooden swords hard enough to break ribs. They wrestled in the dirt until one screamed from pain. The message was simple. If the gladiators lived with suffering every day, you will live with fear every day. The women were not given whips or blades. They were given terror, and terror worked better than chains. The punishment of the pit. Inside every gladiator school was the pit, a deep, stone-lined hole used for discipline. It was cold, damp, dark, barely large enough for one person to crouch. When a woman angered a gladiator or a lanista for refusing a command, for dropping a tool, for speaking out of turn, she was thrown into the pit. Hours passed like days. The walls dripped. Rats scratched. The air smelled like rot. Some women screamed. Others prayed. Most sat in silence, hugging their knees, waiting for the door above them to open. The pit did not break their bones. It broke their minds. When they were dragged out, shaking and pale, they returned to work in silence. The gladiators didn't need chains to control the women. They had fear, the day they were put on display. When the lanista wanted to show power, he didn't show strength. He showed control. He forced captive women into the training yard during the busiest hours of the day, when dozens of gladiators were swinging swords, lifting stones, shouting, and bleeding. The women were placed in the center of the yard, watched from every side. Gladiators trained around them, smashing shields together, throwing spears at wooden targets, slamming each other into the ground. It was a storm of violence, a world the women had never been part of, a world designed to break them. Every mistake they made was punished in front of the entire school. A drop bucket, a stumble, a moment of fear. Gladiators laughed. Some jeered. Some shouted insults. These women weren't being punished with blows. They were being punished with shame. Shame that clung to them long after they left the yard. Shame that made them walk with lowered eyes. Shame that reminded them they were powerless in a place built on brutality. The night of the masks. There were nights inside the school when the torches burned brighter than usual, where the shouts carried farther, when the air felt heavier. These were the nights of the masks. On these nights, the gladiators wore metal helmets from old battles, dented, rusted, stained by men who had died years before. The helmets were symbols. Symbols of violence, symbols of death, symbols of what Rome expected them to be. The women were forced to stand in the yard while the gladiators marched around them in circles, boots crushing the sand, weapons striking shields in rhythm. It was not a ceremony. It was intimidation. The message was simple. You are trapped here with men whose lives are ruled by violence. The masks hid the gladiators' faces, making them look less like men and more like creatures made for killing. The women often cried quietly. Some shook. Some fainted. The lanistas loved these nights because fear controlled better than whips. The breaking of belief. Many of the women had come from villages where they prayed every morning, lit candles every night, and believed the gods watched them. Inside the gladiator school, belief died slowly. They watched the fighters bleed. They watched men die in training. They heard the cries of wounded gladiators echo through the hallways at night. And through it all, they asked the gods for mercy, but none came. Some women stopped praying. Some prayed in whispers. Some prayed only with their eyes closed, too afraid to move their lips. The school tore at their faith until nothing felt real anymore. The women learned that suffering did not stop for the godly, and that Rome rewarded cruelty more than kindness. The ones who were never seen again. Not every woman survived the school. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Some grew sick. Some disappeared after angering the wrong gladiator or the wrong guard. The lanistas never explained where they went. No graves were dug. No prayers were spoken. A woman could be working in the yard in the morning and be gone by sunset. Her tools left behind. Her blanket still in the corner of her small room. The women learned not to ask questions, because in the gladiator school, asking questions was another way to disappear. The arena's final choice. Every gladiator school had one final threat, a punishment no woman wanted to face. The arena, not as a fighter, not as a performer, not as a slave who could win her freedom. As a warning, a captive woman who disobeyed too many times was brought into the arena at dawn when the stands were empty. She would be forced to kneel on the sand, alone, silent, terrified. The lanista would speak from the shadows. This is where the world watches people die. The woman would look around, surrounded by stone seats that once held 50,000 screaming people. She could almost hear the echoes of old battles, could almost see the dust rising from fallen fighters, could almost smell the blood that soaked into the ground years ago. The arena was death's home, and the message was clear. You will obey, or you will join the dead. Most women never disobeyed again. The world remembers gladiators as heroes, symbols of bravery, icons of Rome. But behind the glory, behind the roar of the crowd, behind the shining armor and the raised swords, was a world built on cruelty. And the ones who suffered most were the captive women trapped inside the gladiator schools. They lost their homes. They lost their freedom. They lost their dignity. Some lost their lives. They were punished without reason, humiliated without mercy, threatened with the same death that awaited the fighters. Rome never recorded their names, but their fear still lingers in the ruins of old arenas. Their voices still echo in the broken stone chambers. Their pain still clings to the sand that once soaked the blood of 1,000 battles. What Roman gladiators did to captive women was worse than death, and history refuses to forget it.